I work with adults doing inner healing through action methods. And it's a way of taking the internal world and making it concrete, or the invisible world, the world of feelings you can't see, except through the expression of it. And if they're inside and hidden, then it's a way of making what's invisible visible by what is called concretizing, or making concrete. A simple way of doing that is if you have to work on repairing a relationship with another person, that you have a dialogue with the other person who's not there. So you put them on the empty chair, and I, as the therapist, would be the director of that little piece of communication and have the person reverse roles with the person they want to talk to. For instance, if you have a parent who has died and you have unresolved issues with that parent, then the work would be to repair the relationship and expose or express the feelings that are blocked. And that would be the focus of that interaction. That's just an example of one form of inner healing. There's all kinds of ways that you work with people. It has to do with relationships and the role that a person plays in a relationship. So role theory, which was created by Jacob Moreno, who invented psychodrama, he defined the role as the functioning form of an individual. For example, we are in the role of mother, as well as wife, as well as professional, as well as educator. There are also internal emotional roles. So if you have an overdeveloped role as wife, or let's say overdeveloped role of mother, then you might be mothering your husband, which could cause problems in your marriage, because the husband wants a wife, he doesn't want a mother. Well, you might want a mother, but you'd be better off to have a wife. If the relationship is going to work, it'd probably be better to have a husband-wife role, reciprocity, than a woman who's mothering her husband. So then what you do is you go to work on the role of the overdeveloped mother. And you also go to work on the underdeveloped role of wife. And the stage is a wonderful place to practice life. Really, that's what stages is. And
so do you think of a real stage, or is it just in the room where you are working?
a stage is simply a place where you put the role on display and you express it.
Okay.
And then you begin to operate on the role. It can be one-to-one. It can also be in a group. It's very effective one-to-one. When you work in a group, then it takes on a whole 3, 4, 5 dimensions, and it's very exciting. But that group process isn't always available. The group can be mixed, men and women. It can be just women. It can be just men. It can be set up to focus on specific themes. And if it's individual, then the first thing a person has to figure out is whether they would be better to work with a man or a woman as their therapist, depending on the nature of their issues. This kind of work can take place with teenagers or adults. It's more that the person is ready to do the piece of work. Healing comes in seasons, and the first thing a therapist has to figure out is whether the person is ready for what piece of work, because it would be putting a person at risk to almost rip the bandage off to dress the wound if the bandage is necessary to stay on there for healing. And so there's a timing to healing, there's a timing to what kind of healing, and sometimes you accelerate that process and you see very obvious results. Other times you have to I guess what I would call build the scaffolding. If you're going to do foundational work on a building, you have to build the scaffolding so that when you start to remove the parts that are diseased or need to be replaced, the building doesn't fall down, or the foundation, so that you can operate on the foundations. You got to support the building, otherwise the whole thing will fall down. And it's the same with people. If you're going to go in and operate on a role that's unconscious role and it's very primary role, it takes you back to when you're perhaps very young and that role first went to go wrong and developed in a wrong way. Almost like you have to break the bone to reset it. And that there's a lot of risk in that kind of process. And so it takes a lot of understanding and contracting with a person to figure out when we do what piece of work, what you're ready for. It's not uncommon for people to have to sort out things when they're even 40 and 50 years old that happened when they were very young. The body and the psyche has a way of protecting itself. And when there is trauma in a family situation, it's not safe for the child to work on that trauma, name the trauma, expose it, because if their parents are the cause of it, then they're not going to jeopardize their safety. A child will always protect the parent, even if the parent is dysfunctional. And so often a person can't begin to work on things that happen, bad things that happen to them at home, until they've left home. And that usually is into young adulthood or late teenage, when they go to school, university. Often people that begin to surface with problems are when they've left home. Sometimes people won't arrive at it till even later because they buried it and they're not even conscious of it. The difference between psychotherapy and counseling is that counseling is done with conscious material. It's problem solving. It's all to do with things that you know about. And psychotherapy is unconscious material. It's stuff that has been hidden and that people have, with good reason, to defend themselves and to protect themselves, have forgotten it and blocked it out. Well, they might forget about what happened in terms of their memory, but emotions are like water, which is a quote from Haim Ginott. And he said, if an emotion is not expressed, it'll go somewhere else. So if an emotion arises in oneself like fear, anxiety, anger, rage, and it doesn't come out through your mouth or through your arms and hands or feet, whatever, then it'll find a life inside of you and come out through some other way, like a secondary illness or a physical complaint. Someone might develop arthritis if they're bitter. Someone might develop cancer if they're angry. Now, these are strong statements to make, and it isn't always the case. But the point being that emotional life has a life of its own, and it's got to go somewhere. And so it might not come straight out, but it'll come out in another way. Well, often therapy is about connecting the dots. And so you can figure out, well, what is the origin of this? Where did this first come into being? And again, if you look at the role theory, which comes from Jacob Moreno and the psychodrama training, is that you always look at the locus of the role, or the place where the role was first expressed. And then you track it and to see, well, how did it develop and how did it begin to take on a life of its own? And of course, we're always looking at the dysfunctional roles. The healthy, functional roles you don't have to worry about because they work for you. And it's about what doesn't work for you and what's not okay in your life that leads you to inner healing. It's not uncommon for people to repeat history. And so we learn from those around us. And when you get into object relations, which is a psychological theoretical model, then it's all about the way that you create your sense of self is through those that care for you and those that are around you. And so what's outside of you comes inside of you. And so if what's outside of you is not healthy, then you take on board that behavior yourself, and it becomes part of your own identity, even though it didn't start with you. The other thing is that the absence of carers, the absence of primary caregivers or parents, where often people have difficulties because they didn't get the download from anyone. So they really don't have a strong sense of themselves, and they then have a void that they operate out of. And might be just the absence of one parent. You know that when a parent dies, when a child is like 3 years old or younger, often those people who suffered the loss of a parent from 3 years or younger become suicidal and very depressed when they're adults. And there's been research to show that there's a strong link between losing a parent as a young child and wanting to die. And so you have to look at the source and the root of the problem in order to be able to address it in a way that would be effective and make a lasting difference. So it's really, in a sense, quite simple. You just look at where the blockage is, or look at where the lack is, or look at where development was arrested, and then you go back to that place. I remember I was 23 years old, and I went home and visit my father and would walk around the block with him after dinner and hold his hand like I was 4 years old. And I had the need to go back and be a young child with him again so that I could receive from him what I didn't receive when I was 4 years old, for a number of reasons, some of them very good. But there's a woman called Lillian Rubin who wrote a book called The Transcendent Child, and she studied in her role as a psychotherapist about why some people overcame their difficulties and others did not. And it wasn't to do with the degree of trauma. Those that had the greatest trauma often overcame it, where others had lesser traumas did not. So the thing that made the difference, the transcenders, were the people that went back and got what they didn't have. Then they could move on. So if you have an underdeveloped role as a child, then you need to hook up with someone who will play the role of parent with you. And often that is the therapist. The therapist becomes the parent role for a period of time to repair that broken, dysfunctional role. It's not uncommon for people to break away from a pattern and then find themselves repeating it. And that is what you would do unless there was an intervention, unless there was a way that you could look at how to do it differently. And often people need help with that. And often people arrive at inner healing because of brokenness. Because if everything's going okay, then there's no reason to put yourself in pain to look at things that need to be fixed. Is therapy for everybody?
Yes.
That's an important question. I love therapy. I think it's a luxury. I think it's a wonderful thing for somebody else to come alongside of you and help you to grow. No, it's not for everybody. Some people don't need therapy in their lives, and other people do. And it's all a question of degree. Therapy originally happened within healthy families. It's just part of normal development. That parents who were raised well will repeat that. And there's a lot of intuition that goes into it. We call it common sense, but some people, if it's not common, then you haven't got it, the sense. Well, there's lots of different scenarios that can create healthy family life. And one of them is conflict resolution. So if a parent is misbehaving, if children are strong enough in themselves that they can say, "That's your problem, Dad, don't put it on me," then that's healthy family life. And then if the dad is strong enough to say, "Yes, I'm sorry, I It's not your problem, it's mine. Great. That's a healthy father. It doesn't mean that people don't have problems. We all have problems. It's how we handle them and how we address them and how we resolve them that makes us healthy. And so really therapy is about how you resolve problems, not whether people have them or not.